Right now, everyone is watching the Middle East. The carrier groups, the F-35s, the drone footage, the diplomatic ultimatums, the entire shebang, all of the theatre, all of the war that's going on at the moment is centred on that idea. And while our attention is locked on a country the size of Alaska with the GDP akin to Portugal's, something else is happening. Something more surreptitious, something more pernicious, something quieter, something with no bombs, with no generals, with no cable news countdown clock. The government is borrowing $1 trillion every 100 days. And that's the true war. Not Iran, not Ukraine, the governmental debt. That is where the nation is truly imperiled. It's not borrowing $1 trillion every year, or not over a decade. It's doing it every 100 days. And the mechanism that makes that possible is starting to break. The Treasury markets, the bond markets. And by the end of this video, you're gonna see why that is the true enemy we should be fighting. Not the Iranians, not the Ukrainians, and not another country that ends in an Ian. Here's how the playbook works. Let me break it down. When the government has a real debt addiction problem, it can't solve it politically. So it creates a distraction it can solve militarily. Now that's not conspiracy theory, that's not a tinfoil hat idea, that's history. Rome did it, they debased their currency, Britain did it, the United States spent 20 years in Afghanistan, $2.3 trillion, let alone to mention all of the blood and treasure that was spilled. But the domestic balance sheet quietly has been rotting from the inside. The distraction doesn't have to be a lie. It just has to be louder and more appealing than the truth. And right now the truth is this. The United States has $34 trillion in debt and it's climbing. Gross federal debt. Interest payments on the debt just passed $1 trillion per year. That's more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicaid, more than Medicare. The government is now spending more to service the system than to actually run it. But yeah, go ahead, sure. Keep watching the carrier groups. Keep watching the F-35s. Keep watching the talking heads on the news tell you about the war. But by the end of this video, if you stick with it, you're gonna really see that it's the debt that imperils the nation. Not the war, but the debt. So let's name it clearly, because let's be quite frank, no one else does. The mechanism is called fiscal dominance. And I know that sounds like a bad BDSM film or an S&M movie, but it's not. It works like this. No whips, but balance sheets. Debts that get too large, not just big, but structurally unmanageable. The central bank loses the independence in that scenario. Not because anyone forces it to, not because anyone passes a law, but because the maths stops working. The Federal Reserve has to raise rates to fight inflation. Fine. Normal, textbook, we expect it. But here's what the textbook won't ever tell you. When the government is rolling over $8 to $9 trillion in debt per year, not new debt, just the existing debt that needs to be refinanced, every rate hike the Fed makes costs the Treasury more and more money. Every single basis point. At the current rates, the US is paying an average interest rate approaching 3.3% on its debt, and it's rising because the old debt is cheap at 0.5 to 1% during the zero interest rate period. The Fed will raise rates to cool the economy. Okay, fair enough. The Treasury, in turn, has to bleed more interest payments. Okay, understandable. Then the deficits get larger. The Treasury issues more bonds to cover the gap. The bond market has to absorb them. And if it can't, the Fed quietly steps back in, like an unvirtuous, incestuous relationship. But that's the trap. That's the fiscal dominance. That's the ball and chain. That's the whip. The central bank cannot tighten because the government cannot afford it to. Pressure doesn't disappear, it just moves. And in this case, it moves to the bond market. And when the bond market can't absorb it, it moves to the dollar. And when the dollar absorbs it, it moves to the commodity prices. And then your cost of living. And then eventually to the political system. So no, this isn't about Iran. This is about a machine that transfers pressure away from balance sheets onto people like you and me. So let's see where it goes. Let's get deeper, because this is where it gets really interesting. And quite frankly, abstract and strange. Most people think government spending is simple. Congress approves the budget, money goes out, taxes come in, the gap is borrowed, you know, the difference between what they bring in and what they can't service. Clean, linear, predictable. It's none of those things though, to be honest with you. It's none of those things. This is a mechanism called the Treasury General Account, the TGA for short. It's the USA's government's checking account at the Federal Reserve. And when it gets drained, when the system spends down on the balance, that money floods into the financial system and that creates real inflation. But think of it like a hidden QE. The government draws down its reserves, dollars flow into people's bank accounts, those banks need somewhere to put that liquidity and it ends up in risk assets. Markets go up, not because the earnings improved, not because the economy got better, but because cash needed to go somewhere. We saw this in other cycles, like in 2023. The debt ceiling standoff drained the TGA to nearly zero. Then the ceiling was raised, the Treasury had to rebuild the count, and it started going on and on again. That sucked liquidity out of the system. So what happened? The stocks wobbled, credit markets tightened, and nobody reported it as a monetary event. They reported it as a debt ceiling resolved, and the markets stabilized. That's the misdirection. That's the illusion. The headline says one thing, but the plumbing says another thing altogether. Liquidity over the logic. The system doesn't react, it just flows. And right now, the plumbing is under pressure like it hasn't been under pressure since the 1940s. The last time the US had a debt to GDP ratio this high, they were coming out of World War II, and they solved it through a decade of financial repression. Rates kept artificially low below inflation. And that's what it is, nothing else. We'll come back to that though later on, because that's where we're going to be going again in the future. But the bond market right now is the true battlefield. And here's the part that should scare you more than any missile aimed at Iran or Diego Garcia bases in the Atlantic, wherever it is. The bond market is the largest, most important financial market on earth. United States Treasuries are the foundation of the global financial system. They're the collateral for absolutely everything. Repo markets, derivatives, bank reserves, exchange reserves, everything. And when treasuries are stable, the world is stable. When treasuries wobble, everything wobbles. 2022, think back to it. The UK did something fiscally reckless. They appointed Liz Truss, that's another point, but Liz Truss then announced unfunded tax cuts and the bond market revolted, and that started margin calls, and the Bank of England had to intervene immediately, expeditiously. A sitting prime minister was removed in 45 days, a record in history. 45 days, no election, no coup, the bond market did it. That's the power of what we're talking about. Now ask yourself this, what happens when the largest bond market, not the UK, the United States, what happens when treasuries start to react the same way that happened in the UK? We had a preview of it. The 10-year yield hit 5%. Silicon Valley Bank went bankrupt. Watch their portfolios bleed mark-to-market losses. The Fed didn't fully respond with rate cuts immediately, but it did something interesting. It quietly expanded the Bank Term Funding Program, BTFP, by the something dip. Some people said it, I didn't say it. Letting banks borrow cheaply, basically. In other words, they masked the losses. The pressure didn't disappear, it transmuted, it moved. They moved it from the balance sheets of the regional banks onto the Fed's own balance sheets. They socialized the risk and they privatized the profits. Sound familiar? Of course it does. It just buys time. But what's it buying time for? It's buying time for a rewriting of the system. There's a market that doesn't lie about this. There's a market that can't be talked up or seduced by the press or go into the headlines. It can't be masqueraded and it can't be mendaciously driven away or distracted. And that's gold. And if you're paying attention to gold over the last 18 months, you've noticed something very peculiar. It's hitting all-time highs in a period when, by conventional logic, it shouldn't be. Now, the conventional framework says gold goes up when real rates are low or negative. Gold goes down when real rates are high or positive or the expectation, because, you have to yield-bearing alternatives are readily available. 2023, 2024 broke that framework. Real rates were positive, meaningfully positive, and gold went from $1,800 to over $3,000. Why? Because gold isn't just an inflation hedge like we've been told. It's a sovereign credibility hedge. Gold is the one asset on earth with no counterparty risk. No government backs it. It doesn't need a press conference to maintain confidence. And when the central banks, not retail investors, not Reddit, but central banks, when they start buying gold at the fastest rate in 50 years, the message is very clear. The institutions that understand sovereign credit risk better than everyone else on earth are hedging against the system that they run. China, Russia, Poland, India, Hungary. to name a few. They've all been accumulating gold. It's not a statement, it's not a headline, it's a structural shift. They're not watching the carrier groups in Iran. They're not watching any of those things. They're watching the debt clock. They're watching the counterparty risk get ever increasingly more perilous. They're thinking about liquidity and logic. The system doesn't react. It just flows in those scenarios. So let's bring it back to the headline that we're told to abide by. To Iran, to the Ayatollahs, to the carrier groups, to the theater. War is expensive. We all know that. What's less obvious, though, is how war interacts in a
nearly 20% of global oil supply.
Every dollar spent on military escalation is a dollar borrowed. Make no mistake about that. At current rates, added to the 34 trillion, is compounding. The Iraq war conservatively cost, $2 trillion, including long-term veteran care and interest. It was paid for on a credit card effectively when rates were zero. Cheap debt, low cost to carry. An equivalent conflict of today at 4 to 5% interest rates that we have now, the carrying cost alone in year one would be hundreds of billions of dollars. And here's the irony the hawks never seem to want to mention. Military spending doesn't produce economic output in the way that infrastructure or productivity gains in investment does. It consumes it. It absorbs labor, capital. It produces more debt. You're essentially borrowing against future GDP. Meanwhile, the adversaries are watching this. China, specifically, they're under no illusion about what's happening. Chinese strategists have written explicitly about the United States debt as a strategic vulnerability, about the way that fiscal pressure constrains United States military options, and about how the battlefield is now reacting to it. There's a concept in Chinese strategic doctrine. It's all about identifying financial and economic destabilization. They don't need to fire a shot at America. They just need to stop buying treasuries, or sell slowly, or encourage alternatives to dollar settlement. That's not speculation. That's the stated direction and directive of the BRICS payment infrastructure, or the petro yuan, of bilateral trade deals denominated outside of the dollar. The real war isn't the Strait of Hormuz, it's the Treasury market, and it's already started. And the option markets are another place that are signaling this. Here's something most financial channels won't talk about because it requires understanding of market structure, of the Greeks, of gamma or theta, and it's a bit more complicated. The options market in US Treasuries, and specifically in TLTs, the long bond ETF, for another word, has been showing something very interesting recently. Dealers are structurally short gamma on the long end of the curve. Okay, that's a bunch of mumbo jumbo. What does that mean? When the dealers are short the gamma, they have to chase the moves. Think about short gamma squeezes. When yields rise, they have to sell bonds to hedge, which pushes the yields even higher. When yields fall, they buy, which pushes them lower. The positioning amplifies directional moves rather than dampening them. Not like volatility suppression, but adding gasoline to the fire. In a structurally sound treasury market, you'd expect natural buyers to step in and dampen yield spikes. We've seen it in recent treasury volatility events. October 2023, March 2020, September 2022 is the opposite. Moves accelerate the bid-ask spreads, and they widen. This is what the treasury market structure looks like under stress. Not a crash, not a sudden collapse, a slow, episodic degradation of the function. Each intervention adds more to the balance sheet. Each balance sheet expansion is inflationary at the margin. Each inflation pulse forces a political response. Each political response creates more spending commitments. The loop doesn't close, it just ends up tightening in that scenario. And right now it's moving to a moment where the Fed will have no good option, whether they either let rates destroy the fiscal position or they let inflation destroy the currency. They're in a really tricky scenario. That's the binary event they built. So where does the pressure leak? It leaks into commodity prices. And I know the dollar is rearing right now, and I know gold is not. But it's going to leak into a place where the dollar loses credibility as a store of value and real assets reprice upwards. We're seeing it in oil. You're going to see it in gold and silver, agricultural inputs, the cost of fertilizer, the cost of your life in real term goes up because of supply shocks. It leaks into interest rates and specifically into the cost of everything that is rate sensitive. Bye-bye mortgage, bye-bye car loan, bye-bye business credit. The private sector gets crowded out, not by legislation, but by the simple simple math. It leaks into the dollar itself slowly, not dramatically. The dollar doesn't collapse like some soap opera, but it's going to erode slowly. A death by 1,000 cuts, purchasing power, global share of reserve holdings, settlement currency dominance. These moves take years and decades, not days, but they do move. And when it leaks, more importantly, it leaks into political systems. When the cost of living rises faster than wages, when homeowners become generational fantasy players because they can't get onto the property ladder, when the social contract starts to feel like fraud, that pressure doesn't stay economic, it becomes political. And political pressure, channeled correctly or incorrectly, is where the nearest enemy finds an opportunity. The carrier group, the countdown clock, the headline war. The system doesn't choose Iran randomly. It chooses the loudest possible distraction from the quietest possible crisis or crises. Because the debt problem has no clean military solution. No surgical strike fixes it. No regime change restores the bond market's confidence. No victory parade reduces the deficit, but it does change the subject. And changing the subject buys you time. And that's what fiscal dominance is best at. Now, by the end of this video you're supposed to see where the pressure leaks. And I hope you do. But it doesn't leak in Tehran. It doesn't leak on a carrier deck. It doesn't leak through any of the mechanisms they'll show you on the news tonight. It leaks into the Treasury market, the repo window, the gold price, your mortgage, your grocery bill, your gas price, and in quiet structural transferring of purchasing power from people who work for money to systems that borrow money. The war you should be worried about doesn't have bombs. It doesn't have F-35s. It doesn't have frigates. It has bond auctions, yield curves, a debt clock. The system doesn't react. It never does. It flows. Liquidity. And right now, it's flowing directly towards you. Whew.